Fellas, it feels like in 2024, the UFC only really care about promoting the already big cards, the ones with Conor McGregor, the ones with John Jones, and it feels like the UFC only really care to hype up and promote cards that are already going to be big pay-per-views because of the people on that card. But I feel like for the lower level pay-per-views with less stars, you know, fight nights and everything, the UFC kind of just don't really give a crap about promoting any of these cards. So I've decided to go for a few ways I think the UFC can create more hype for these individual fight cards. This isn't going to be how they can create more hype for a business themselves. Obviously, if they do increase the hype for a card, that may result in growing their business. But this is just going to be how they can increase each individual fight card. And I'm not just going to go with a generic answer, make the card better. I'm going to come up with multiple ways I think the UFC could generate more hype for some of these cards. This is going to be for both pay-per-views and fight nights. So yeah, I've got some honourable mentions as well that I'm going to go over before I go over the main reasons. So we'll go over the honourable mentions first. The first honourable mention is no more going to the Apex. The Apex just completely deadens the atmosphere at every single UFC event. Think about how many good cards we could have had this year that ended up not being that great or not that memorable because they didn't end up going to the, an actual venue and they're just sat in the Apex. Look at that Shamil Gaziev versus Rosenstruik card. This was a really good fight night. You've got Rosenstruik, Vitor Petrino, Umar Nurmagomedov, Steve Erceg, Mohamed Makayev, all of these guys on the same card. And I can guarantee you don't really remember much from this card because it wasn't in front of a venue. And I'm not saying it needs to be in front of a massive venue. Stick it somewhere in Abu Dhabi. I know Abu Dhabi aren't a great crowd, but it would have been better than the Apex. And I feel like that card would have gone down as one of the best fight cards this year had it been in front of a crowd. So I feel like the UFC going to the Apex just completely deadens the atmosphere. And I'm not even saying they need to blow their load and go to some massive venue for these fight nights. Look at that Merab versus Yan card. I swear that card felt like there was only like 1,000 people in the crowd, but it was still better than nothing. Go to a venue if you don't want to go to a massive venue of like 1,000, 2,000 people. Just some crowd is better than nothing. So the Apex needs to be scrapped. And I will say, it does look like the UFC are taking a step in the right direction because they are tending to have a lot more crowd events nowadays. They tend to be kind of shifting away from the Apex, and it feels like we're finally getting more cards in front of a crowd. But the Apex needs to go. Like I said, even if you don't want to, spend too much on a card and go to the Apex, at least just go in some form of venue, because it feels like the UFC are kind of just, they realize that they've got a week off, stick 2 random dudes on the card, do it in front of the Apex and never care about it again. And I feel that's a very lazy way of doing it. So get rid of the Apex. We ain't in COVID anymore. We don't need this. Let's start having more crowded events, and I feel like there's no excuse for it anymore, even if it's just a small venue. The next honourable mention is, I think main eventers for both pay-per-views and fight nights must have some sort of hype or name value. I'm kind of sick of these main eventers being people with no hype or name value. And when I say hype, I'm talking about an up-and-coming prospect. I'm talking about, a potential future star. Guys who the UFC, and when I say the UFC, I mean the fans, have a lot of stock bought into. Basically, a lot of big prospects going against each other, like an Ikram Aliskerov versus a Roman Kopylov, a Bo Nickel main event, something like that. Guys with a lot of hype around their name, or people who are already established, well-known ranked people going against each other. Names who we're all familiar with, potential #1 contender fights. I think those are some fair main events. So a couple of good examples of that was back in the day when we had Alexander Volkov versus Cyril Garnett. If we're talking more recently, we've got a lot of examples of this. I mean, Cannonier versus Imavov, that's a really good example, as you can see, of a fight night that's got a lot of interest in it. Sandhagen versus Umar Nurmagomedov. You've got the name value of Sir Corey Sandhagen. You've got the hype of Umar Nurmagomedov. Ankalaev versus Walker. These are some good examples of fight nights with hype and a lot of name value around them. But we've also had a lot of fight cards this year with fighters surrounding, fighters main eventing with zero hype and zero name value. Mateusz Nicolau versus Alex Perez. This is the main attraction of a card. Where is the hype for this fight? Where is the name value for this fight? This is the main attraction. Ribat versus Namajunas. Namajunas was on a 2-fight losing streak. Where was the hype for Ribat versus Namajunas? Shamil Gaziev versus Rosenstruik. I know I just talked about this card being good, and I know people are going to be like ironically saying they liked it because of Gaziev, and he's kind of turned into a meme now. But unironically, when this fight got officially announced, this was horrible. This was slop on a card, and this was the main event of the card over Makayev and Nurmagomedov. And an up-and-coming card, Lemos versus Jandiroba. And don't even start calling me a casual because I'm saying this is a bad fight. If you want to watch this fight, you go do this. If you want to, tune in. Listen, I'm not saying it's going to be a bad fight. I'm sure it's going to be a pretty good fight. And, we're probably going to see the division start moving after this fight. But hype, name value for Lemos and Jandiroba, there's none there. The UFC need to start making these main events. And like I said, it can be a fight night or a pay-per-view. They have to have at least some sort of name value already on the card. Or it must be between people with a lot of hype generated. Rather than just feeding us slop, they need to start generating some hype because this is the main attraction of a card. So that's my second honorable mention. And the third one is the bout orders need a change. They need to change the bout orders of these cards. I'm not saying they need to add or remove any fights. Just simply change the bout orders. Let's take this week anyway. UFC Denver. It was actually a really good card on paper. And I'm going to be talking about on paper because obviously this is how you generate hype. This isn't performance-based. But simply switching the bout around, I think could have generated a lot more hype because you're going to have to look through the prelims. And there's a lot of fights on the prelims that are actually better than fights on the main card. So I think the co-main event should have been Drew Dober versus Gene Silver. Gene Silver's coming off a KO over Charles Jourdain. And he's, got a lot of hype to his name against Drew Dober, who's one of the best unranked lightweights. That should have been the co-main event off the bat. Have Joshua Van versus Johnson as the featured fight of the card. Joshua Van is one of the biggest prospects in the UFC right now. Why is he on the prelims? Get him on the featured fight. Then you do Ponzinibbio versus Salikov. Then you have Al Hassan versus Brundage, and then open up the card with a Rosa and Rodriguez. And if you want to kick off, end off the prelims with a bang, that's where you do Gabriel Bonfim, headlining the prelims against Lusa. That is what the card should have been. Simply just changing the bout of a couple fight cards, I think, could make it a lot better. Look at UFC 303. Why was Ian Gary versus MVP so low down on the card? Why was Anthony Smith versus Roman Dolidze the featured fight? Why was Macy Chiasson versus Mara Bueno Silva above Ian Gary in MVP? And again, I know they didn't perform that well on paper, performance-wise, but on paper, it should have never been that way. So simply just changing the bout order, in my opinion, could definitely create a lot more hype for these cards. But those are the honorable mentions out the way. These are things that I think the UFC could do that would definitely benefit them. But now we're going to go on over to the main things that I think would increase hype over these cards. The first thing being longer press conferences. Why are the UFC press conferences getting shorter and shorter? I feel like the UFC 303 press conference is a really good example of this. It was like 15 minutes long. The first 15 minutes are always going to be boring. Get the John Morgans out the way. Get the guys who are going to ask the most generic questions out the way in the first 15 minutes. That is what the first 15 minutes are for. The second half of the press conference, that's where you allow the other guys to ask questions and start, riling up people. Look at Ian Gary and MVP. They started heating up in that press conference, and as soon as it started heating up, Dana ended the press conference. We need longer press conferences. I'm not saying we need to allow crowds and allow the crowd to start, answering questions, because every single time they do that, they make it a cringe fest. Just make the press conferences longer. It allows for more moments. Something's got to happen if you make the press conference longer. And I feel like these shorter press conferences, they're not doing anything for promotion because they're just answering the same question. They just all happen to be there. So I think longer press conferences is a really good way to create a lot more hype for your cards. The next one I've got is promote cards earlier, not just the week of. It feels like a lot of these fight nights in the UFC, and I know we're going through a bit of a crisis of fighters pulling out. It feels like in every single main event somebody pulls out. But I feel like a lot of these fight nights, we're getting aware of these fight nights like 3 weeks before they take place. Jandiroba versus Lemos. I only knew that was a fight night main event like 3 weeks before it took place. That's way too early. How are we supposed to have any interest in that fight card if they're not promoting it early on? I feel like the UFC, where it comes to fight nights, they need to announce these fight nights early on and promote them earlier. And I know they do it, like I said, for the already big fight nights, like Sandhagen versus Nurmagomedov, but for every fight night, they need to be promoting them earlier, not just the week of, showing highlights of the fighters. Promote the cards earlier, get people interested and aware of the cards earlier, rather than just, starting the card on 3 weeks and then giving us 3 weeks to get hype for this card. You need to start promoting them earlier, releasing them earlier, and that is another thing I think the UFC can do to specifically increase the hype for fight nights. And I know, like I said, there's a lot of people pulling out, which may get in the way of that, but just start promoting the cards earlier. The next one I've got is don't be afraid to go worldwide. And listen, the UFC once had a time where they had 3 African champions: Adesanya, Kamaru Usman, Francis Ngannou. Why did the UFC never do a UFC Africa? The opportunity was there waiting for them. Why did the UFC never do a UFC Africa early this year? Zhang Weili versus Yang Jianan, China on China action. Why was that never a fight night main event in China with the co-main event of PTN versus Song Yadong? Obviously, those took place on different cards. Why did the UFC not go to China? The opportunity was there for the taking. Why are the UFC not planning a UFC Japan card? They've just signed Kai Asakura, who's one of the biggest stars in Japanese MMA. You've got a massive prospect in Tatsuro Taira, who's undefeated. Why is there not a fight night announced for UFC Japan. I feel like the UFC are missing all of these opportunities to go to these countries and increase their name value or increase their brand. Look at Spain. Spain just had like an influencer boxing event and it was absolutely fucking massive. Spain are hungry for a big star. You do Ilia Topuria versus Max Holloway and it will blow the roof off the place in Spain. The UFC need to start going to these other locations. And like I said, I know they do tend to go to locations a lot, but I'm not saying we need another UFC London or another UFC Paris or a third UFC Abu Dhabi. Let's expand where the UFC are going. And it seems like they are experimenting. They did it with UFC Saudi Arabia. And I'm not saying they need to risk pay-per-views. I can understand why the UFC might be hesitant on doing pay-per-views in these venues that they've never gone to, in these countries that they've never gone to. It is quite risky, but at least for a fight night, what's the worst that could happen? Do a fight night in a venue in one of these countries and grow the stock of the UFC worldwide. Turn Dana White into Pitbull. The UFC need to go worldwide, and they need to stop being afraid and just going to the same generic places, USA, and then every now and then they'll go to a different country for a fight night, and then it'll be in front of the Apex. It's just the same thing over again. You want to grow your stock and hype for these fighters from different countries, go to that country and get them familiar with these fighters. That's another way I think the UFC can massively hype and benefit on these fighters. The next one is a face-to-face for the main and the co-main event. I swear the last face-to-face, and this isn't factual information, this is just off the top of my head, but I swear the last face-to-face that took place in the UFC was Dominic Cruz versus Marlon Vera. Ever since that fight, I don't remember them ever doing a face-to-face. This is one of the best forms of promotion you can ever do. Look at the views that face-to-faces do on boxing. Look at the moments that it comes with. This is one of the best forms of promotion you can possibly do. You've got two guys in a room where the tensions are high, someone initiating and asking the questions. This is bound to create a moment. This is bound to create animosity between two fighters. Even if beforehand they didn't really have any beef or they didn't really have any, disagreements with each other. This is the perfect place to rile up fighters. Do it before a press conference. Rile them up before a press conference by doing a face-to-face, which is going to make for a good press conference. It's one of the best forms of promotion, and I feel like it should kind of be mandatory for every main and co-main event for a pay-per-view. And fair enough if the fighters obviously aren't going to have any kind of animosity, but if there's a rivalry there, do it. Dricus du Plessis versus Adesanya, do a face-to-face. MVP versus Ian Gary, I know that wasn't the co-main event, but that should have had a face-to-face. Conor McGregor versus Chandler, if that would have gone down, imagine the face-to-face. I feel like the UFC, they need to, cash in on these face-to-faces, man. It's one of the best forms of promotion you can do, and the UFC never do it, so that's another way I think the UFC can grow their stock. And finally, the one that I think is the most important one is simply make cards better. You can't polish a turd. You can't get as interested in things that are shit. Simply make better cards. You can make as much promotion as you want, but if the fights aren't good and the fights aren't happy, then the fans aren't happy with the main event, they ain't going to be hyped up. Simply making the cards better is going to generate more hype. And I'm not saying every card needs to be UFC 300 where you stack it from top to bottom. And I've already done a video where I've gone over a shit ton of fight night main event opportunities that the UFC could have done to make cards better. So there's no excuses for having these terrible main events. Simply make the cards better. And as a result of that, it will naturally increase the hype for these cards. It's not rocket science. Don't feed us slop and it won't perform like slop. But that is some ways I think the UFC can massively increase the hype for these individual fight cards. Let me know your thoughts on these reasons. Do you agree with the ways I've got? Do you disagree with the methods? Let me know your thoughts. Thank you for watching.